The Southern Centre for Inequality Studies, that's the SCIS at Wits University, together with two other international institutions, the Louvain Institute and the World Inequality Lab at the Paris School of Economics, have authored a paper on the implementation of a wealth tax on the richest 1% of the population. They suggest this would achieve two things: a collection of additional revenue needed by government, as well as reducing inequality in South Africa in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. The paper says successful implementation would achieve long-term implications, providing political stability, fiscal sustainability, and reduce extreme wealth inequality. Let's talk about this. Joining us to discuss it is Sanusha Naidu, Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue. And also joining us, we've got Léo Czajka, who is a researcher in economics at the Louvain Institute of Data Analysis and Modelling in Economics and Statistics. Good to have both of you. Welcome.
Good morning, Leah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Léo, let me begin with you. This study, the new study, builds up on your existing research on wealth inequality in South Africa. We already have an idea from face value, but briefly tell us, what does that study on inequality in South Africa actually reveal?
So this study we worked on last year reveals when you combine all the available data sources about wealth, reveals that wealth inequality in South Africa have remained at extreme level since the end of apartheid. And so at levels that are higher than anywhere in the world where a similar exercise can be undertaken. That is, the top 1% of the distribution, for instance, owns about 55% of the total wealth. And if you go a little bit upper in the distribution, the top 0.01 richest of the population owns about 15% of the total wealth. That is approximately the same as the bottom 50% of the population.
Sure. I mean, it's unbelievable. And obviously, Léo, with coronavirus and COVID-19, and I know there have been a lot of reports that have come out now talking to how the inequality gap has increased exponentially. That, I think it was a report that came out basically showing how the mega rich have already recovered from the pandemic, and the poor at least a decade to even try and see the light. This is the reality that we're looking at. So my question is, this obviously has exacerbated the situation, COVID-19.
That's also what we think. Even though we do not have data past the COVID crisis, but the COVID crisis is typically a crisis that stops the income coming. So people who do not have any savings are struck stronger than people who already have savings. So the interaction between wealth inequality and the COVID crisis is typically likely to produce, indeed, like to increase wealth inequality.
If I'm not mistaken, Léo, this was exactly what was suggested by Russian President Vladimir Putin at the onset of COVID-19 last year, this whole idea of a wealth tax. What were the pros and cons of this?
I'm not sure I'm familiar with this proposal that was made, but let me just say what in general are the pros and cons, because we reviewed the literature about the pros and cons of a wealth tax. And so you have, say, three or four major critiques, right? One is about tax evasion. People say that rich people will be able to evade tax by migrating or underreporting their assets. The other is that it will give disincentive to investment, so it will have a negative impact on investment in the country and therefore a negative impact on growth. There's also a question about the feasibility of the tax, because it requires having information from different third-party actors about different types of assets, so it might be hard for the administration to actually implement such tax. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's the question of whether the tax collected will be well spent, which is a topic that affects any sort of taxes, of course, then of course it also applies to the wealth tax. We try to address, at least open the discussion about each of these very topics in our paper. So we explain why we believe it should be feasible, showing historical example as well as current example, for instance, in Colombia, which have managed to implement a wealth tax. We also factor in potential evasion by decreasing the taxable wealth, the tax base, by some factor. In our main estimation, it's about 30%. So even when assuming a 30% evasion rate, we still estimate that the wealth tax we propose would allow to collect 134 billion. And we also discuss potential negative impact on growth. Here we remain a little bit like general. We just say that I think what one should consider when trying to answer this question, one should always balance this potential negative impact with the potential positive impact induced by the investment of the tax collected. Yeah. It's not that all investors will leave, and if adequately spent, the money collected can help also future growth.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a lot of money you're referring to. I mean, if in fact this does go ahead. I mean, just getting back to what I was saying about the Russian story, I know that this was, I think it was in the middle of last year, about June or July, Vladimir Putin saying that the wealth tax for the extra wealthy would go up, I think, to 15%, as opposed to the 13% that everyone else pays. And then that extra money was going to be given towards sick children or something along those lines. That was what was said. I think it's meant to be introduced now. But let's come back home. Sanusha, just last week, the National Treasury was suggesting a tax increase to deal with the challenges presented by COVID-19 in South Africa. Let's talk about the impact that this would have for the working class and households in the South African context.
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you to Leo. I think this is really a fascinating and important discussion, and I think in the context of South Africa, it's an ongoing debate, as it is globally. What the Treasury announced last week, or what I would think it tested the waters with the announcement, is to gauge to what extent a tax, a kind of calibration of the tax and a hike in the tax would actually have in terms of public opinion. It's unclear at this point what this proposed tax hike would entail. Would it incorporate what Leo is talking about in terms of trying to put together a formula or a policy that would target this kind of 1% of the population that live in extreme wealth situation, and they're extremely rich. And included in that would be the whole question around how would the mechanics of it work. I think generally speaking, the renouncement or the kind of proposal or proposition that the Treasury put out last week hasn't really been received in the kind of way that people have reacted to it. I think there's a mixed reaction to it. I think from civil society organizations, they probably agree that there should be a tax hike, but particularly how will this tax hike work? So in South Africa, you have a very small tax base that covers a very broad, major social development dependency and constituency that rely on various types of welfare grants in South Africa. And this tax base that we are talking about is kind of overstretched in terms of the kind of money that they have to pay in terms of personal income tax. At the same time, the contradiction in South Africa is for many years, and particularly in terms of our own tax base, the wealthy parts of the tax base don't really get to pay as much as they should be paying. And they find ways. I mean, I think what Leo was pointing out to the 4 ways in which the implementation of this wealth tax will take place, and the negativity, etc., around implementation, tax evasion, questions of feasibility and effectiveness. I think in South Africa, you find that there are those that are able to basically pay less than what their yearly income is, and also in terms of how they represent their tax returns, and so they get rebates, or they get tax cuts in terms of what they can put in as their tax return. So I'm very curious to see what this tax hike would entail, and whether or not Treasury would also include there some kind of increase where you don't frighten away investors, but you say to investors, we need to have some kind of increase in the corporate tax base, because there's also that question. But we've also seen, Leanne, that, for example, in the alcohol industry, we saw one of the major industry actors saying that they won't be able to invest the 1.5 billion or 2.5 billion or whatever it was to the President's Investment Facility Fund. Now, again, these are basically very important markers or benchmarkers that we need to start thinking about, because my feeling is that if they're going to do a uniform blanket tax hike in South Africa, you're going to have a kind of juxtaposition emerging where the middle class and those that are basically also being kind of at the margins or haven't been able to maintain the kind of economic household income that they normally have, they're going to basically become very frustrated. And I think if you look at parts of South America where the middle class, not necessarily the 1% that are the richest class in South Africa, but the middle class that sustain the tax base, they are becoming very frustrated because they are also hurting. So I can see where this is coming from, but I think the problem here is the mechanics of the operation. I don't think that by Treasury just making the announcement, it's going to create any kind of positive attitude to it, because again, we're sitting in a very precarious situation in South Africa with the whole question of what has been happening to our COVID-19 PPE funding, the resources, the corruption and the tender fraud, but also in terms of state capture. And I think this is where it's going to be very difficult to sell something like this to the South African public. But again, it's the mechanics of it.
Well, I mean, it's been tried. I mean, if we go back to 2017 under Pravin Gordhan, it was the same kind of scenario that I think it was anyone over 1.5 million rand earning would basically, which was about 103,000 people. I'm reading this one over here. And the earning over 1.5 million a year, the estimated income from these measures was supposed to be around 23 billion rand. That never worked because, as you said, the rich know how to skip the system. And in fact, what had happened when it came back to that 2018 reporting year, they collected far less than they ever have before. And this for various reasons, but for a lot of the time, people judge, they skip, they get away from paying these taxes, these wealth taxes that we talk about. I mean, do you really think that it could work here, Sanusha? It's a great idea on paper, but in reality, will this really work?
For me, Leanne, I completely support the idea, particularly globally as well. And then, of course, there's also the other global debates around a universal basic income grant, which again has also been put out in the South African context and been debated, and different discussions have been had around it. The challenge we have in South Africa, and I'm cautiously optimistic, and sometimes I lean more to the cautious alignment to the fact that this may not necessarily have the traction that it should have, is that in South Africa we have this culture of how to evade the taxman. And it's very much the upper end of the tax bracket that have all of these resources and tools in order to do that. And so to be able to implement something like that, I think we also got to think about the idea of how do you change that culture that, you in terms of what you're earning, in terms of your household income, in terms of how you make your money. Most of them also have to think about, in terms of this 1%, have to think about what relationship they have with the state, and more importantly, what relationship they have with political elites in government. And this is where I'm referring to the whole question of this relationship, this economic relationship to the state and to the state coffers, because here are people who have also made money through their tender processes, through their engagement, through their transactional relationships with the state. And so for me, this is something that really needs to be a discussion that needs to be unpacked even further and disaggregated along the lines of identifying these relationships and how these people have made money, also being part of some of these networks and some of these patronage relationships where they've been enjoying the kind of state resources in terms of contracts, tenders, etc. And then this means that these individuals have to be also then told that you can't be making money out of the state and not paying the requisite tax that should be paid in this way. The second thing here as well is we've got a bureaucracy in the state that is very, very bloated, and it also eats up a big chunk of our tax base in terms of public sector salaries, the salaries that are in the public sector. And I think this again also means how do you deal with them in a way, because it seems to me that we're going in a round circle, we're going through a revolving door, that we're using these tax hikes or the money that's coming from our tax base to pay very, very big salaries to people particularly in the public sector, in the bureaucracy. How do you change that? Do they have to now take a slash, as has been a constant theme in Minister Tito Mbowene's budget speech and his interviews, that we need to reduce the public sector wage bill? And this also means that you can't be using this money to pay for that wage bill.
Indeed. Well, very quickly, I mean, this conversation is not anything that is unique to South Africa, because, I mean, I'm even reading about what they're proposing in Washington. Same thing, wealth tax, where they've got guys like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos that are living, and about 100 other ultra billionaires that they are wanting to impose the same tax on. But Leo, let me come to you just to wrap this up, and very quickly, please, we're running out of time. We already, as South Africans, have a high tax base. I mean, it is, when you compare us to other countries, it's absolutely, it is ridiculous. We have a very high tax base compared to GDP. So taxes keep going up, the economy keeps going down. What do we hope is going to happen with this? Can people honestly afford more taxes? There's talk about taxes now to pay for the vaccine from all angles, but South Africans, can they really afford more taxes?
Well, I mean, it's of course the key question, right? But let me just remind a few things about at least the wealth tax system in South Africa and the tax we propose. So at the moment, there is no tax on wealth, and wealth itself is really little taxed. So taxes on property, such as the estate duty or the transfer duty, collect very little as compared to other tax instruments. Now, it's true that the income tax is progressive, the personal income tax, but then some forms of income are less taxed than others. Typically, the dividends are paid at a flat rate of 20%, I think, and which is not the top marginal rate. So if you go towards the very highest part of the distribution, then the general tax system might not be as progressive as it seems at first. Right. Now, let me just also remind that with the wealth tax we propose, by design, the richest people will remain the richest people after the tax. So it's not something that suddenly reshuffles everything. Yeah. Well, there will be tax for sure, but they will remain the richest. Also, by design, the richest people, so those people that will be most taxed with our design, will only be taxed by 4.4% on their wealth.
Okay, we need to leave it there. Thank you so very, very much to both of you for joining us. Sanusha, from the Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Leo, also a researcher in economics at the Louvain Institute of Data. So we've got to leave it there. That's the story of wealth tax, an interesting one to touch on this morning, but we've got to say goodbye to our SABC2 viewers.